This week on the Lectures in History podcast, Hillsdale College history professor Mark Moyar discusses competing interpretations of the Vietnam War regarding the inevitability of the war and its outcome. He has written extensively about the Vietnam War, U.S. military history, and the role of the United States military abroad. Currently, Mark Moyar is Hillsdale College's William P. Harris Chair of Military History. Previously, he was the director of the Office of Civilian Military History at USAID from 2018 to 2019. A note to our listeners. Since the academic year is completed, C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast will not have new episodes until September. Throughout the summer, we will post some of our most interesting lectures and other history-related episodes. Professor Mark Moyar's lecture begins in a moment.
Today, our subject is going to be the major schools of thought on the Vietnam War. And as we talked about in the last lecture, the stakes in the debate over the Vietnam War are very high. For many decades, and to some extent till today, the competing interpretations of the war have dominated American debates over American national security strategy and over American national identity. And so for this reason, among others, the animosity between the two camps has been quite strong. Now, Michael Kort, in the section you read for today, spells out the two main schools of thought, the Orthodox and the Revisionist. And most of the early histories of the war can be put into one of these two camps. Now, in the last few decades, we've seen some historians who have tried to say that they don't fit into either camp, and sometimes that's true. Sometimes they are simply trying to avoid controversy. But there are also books that don't necessarily really fit into either camp simply because they're very specialized. They're on a small section of the war, not really germane to the big questions. But most of the new books still do, I would say, fit closer to one camp than the other. And it's not, of course, unusual for historians to be divided into competing schools, as historians, certainly in this country, are trained to interpret the facts and not simply to recite facts. And when you interpret facts, you are going to reach conclusions, and we are unlikely to all come to the same conclusion. So when I talk about the big questions of Vietnam, there are two that stand out above all else and are fundamental to this debate. The first is, was the Vietnam War necessary for the protection of American interests? According to the Orthodox school, the answer is no, the war was not necessary to protect American interests. The Revisionists, on the other hand, say, yes, in fact, the war was strategically necessary. It was necessary to protect American interests. The second fundamental question is, was the war winnable? Orthodox school says no, the war was not winnable. Revisionists say yes, in fact, the war was winnable had different courses of action been taken. I'm not going to go into all the many points of divergence. Kort covers them in some detail, and we're also going to be going through them as we go along, but I do want to focus on a few key points in this debate that will help us as we go forward studying the war. So to understand the historiography, I think it's necessary to understand the environment in which it has arisen. And many of you have already learned in other history courses that the political, cultural climate often influences how history is written. Just not to say that all historians are prisoners of their culture or society or their viewpoint, and certainly historians strive to write without allowing their ideological agendas or personal agendas or biases get in the way of their interpretations. But humans being what they are, they do tend to be susceptible to biases, and I think it would be a mistake to think that personal or ideological agendas play no role in the history of war. I think for those of you who are doing media, you know well bias is a constant factor in the media, and given human nature, it's no different in history. So it is worth thinking a bit about how potential agendas or biases or incentives have affected the study of the war. I mentioned last time that the Vietnam War takes place as the baby boom generation is coming of age. And when they get there, the faculty is dominated by what we call the greatest generation. Any of you know what the greatest generation refers to? Over here.
The generation who fought in World War II, right?
Yeah, so it's the generation that fought through World War II, and they lived through the Depression first, and we herald them as the great victors of history. And then this generation generally admired the United States, its institutions, its traditions, and the professors of that generation viewed the university positively as a way to carry on American traditions as well as to teach people to think. Who knows what came after the greatest generation?
Yeah. That'd be the silent generation.
Good, yes, the silent generation. We don't hear nearly as much about them, probably because they were silent. But a lot of the younger faculty in the Vietnam era are from the silent generation. And these are people born between 1928 and 1945. And they too have a strong respect for nation and tradition. And this was still in the 1960s, a time when history was generally used to highlight the best of the United States and not the worst of it, although it didn't mean they ignored the shortcomings. So these professors, by and large in the 1960s, accepted the national security consensus of the early Cold War, which held that the United States had to contain communism, even if it meant waging war in distant places like Korea and Vietnam. They did, in general, also accept people who held different views, and this concept of pluralism has its roots in Christianity, Western civilization, and the American experience, which you've all studied already here in other courses. Part of that tradition is a certain degree of intellectual humility, believing that no person is omniscient, and therefore we need to be prepared to recognize we might get something wrong. And this, of course, also informs the founding of this country with the First Amendment, where we give people the right to free speech and we don't allow authorities to suppress speech. There was, in the 1960s, a small but growing radical element which did not accept the Cold War national security consensus, and they did not also necessarily accept this idea of humility of opinion. The college campuses do not really see a lot of protest in the first 2 years of American involvement. So American troops get in 1965, the middle of 65, but it's not till the middle of 1967 that we see the campus protests surging, and it's only in select places. So what is it that happens in the middle of 1967? Well, the war doesn't change very much, and public opinion in general doesn't change, but we do see draft deferments changing for college students. And up until this point, you could get a deferment after you graduate from college by going to graduate school. You could go to law school or medical school, get a master's degree, etc. And so now most college students don't have that pathway out. And some of them aren't excited about this idea of going into the military or Vietnam. There is one exception I should note. Divinity school is still allowed as an option. And if you know anything about American divinity schools, they've gone pretty far off the deep end since the 1960s. And one of the reasons is they get all these people who are trying to not go to Vietnam. So if you aren't going to go to divinity school, there are some other ways you can get out. Medical deferments being among the most common, and often very easy to fake these. You can pretend to be having suicidal thoughts, or you can fail tests for color blindness by pretending you can't see colors, or you can lose a lot of weight. And so a lot of people do this. And so we will see a lot of the people who avoid the draft end up being those who are most critical of the war. And I think my own view is they're trying to justify to themselves and to other people why it was. Traditionally in this country, we think that time of war, men should go off and fight in the war. So if you're going to avoid that, there is an incentive to say, well, this war was something terribly wrong, and therefore there was, this wasn't the Great World War II where we went off to fight the Nazis and Japanese. This is a war we shouldn't fight. And so a lot of these people will then become professors and journalists, and usually on the left side of the political spectrum, and they will they'll be allowed in by the silent generation, which is generally sort of open to alternative ideas, although once they get into the professoriate, they won't reciprocate and let people in who they disagree with. And we can see this particularly with respect to Vietnam veterans. So while you have a huge number of college professors who oppose the war, there's very few Vietnam veterans in the faculty. And there was a survey taken in 1997 that found that only 1% of college faculty had served in Vietnam, a tiny amount for the amount of Americans who served there. And so as a result of this, the early history of the war will be written primarily by people who were opposed to the war at the time. Now, some of these people belong to the silent generation, but the boomers will overtake them, very large group, very loud, unlike the silent generation, opinionated. And because of the fact that most of this early history is written by people who opposed the war, we tend to refer to it as the orthodox school of Vietnamese Vietnam War historiography. So where did they get the material for this? Well, a lot of the narrative that becomes orthodoxy comes from a small number of journalistic accounts. And the three most prominent of these journalists are some people who we're going to be seeing repeatedly. We'll put their names up here. David Halberstam, Neil Sheehan, Stanley Carnot. So Halberstam writes several books. His most famous is called The Best and the Brightest, and that phrase often gets used later in other contexts. And they're also writing during the war, but their books are really what vault them into fame. Carnot publishes a book called Vietnam: A History that also comes out with a PBS documentary, and we will be looking at some of that documentary later. And then Sheehan's big book is called A Bright Shining Lie. And we're going to look, as we move along, in more detail about how these three actually shape so much of the thinking and analyze to what extent they were correct. All right, so talk some more about how the Orthodox school answers these big questions. So the first question, was the war strategically necessary? Again, Orthodox school says, nope, American involvement was not necessary to protect America's interests. And they dispute the validity of the principal rationale for the U.S. involvement, which is the so-called domino theory. And according to the domino theory, if Vietnam falls, then the other countries in the region are also going to fall like dominoes, even potentially countries beyond Asia, but countries of more importance in Vietnam. And this idea actually goes all the way back to the Truman administration when they are first contemplating supporting the French who were at that time in Vietnam. And it will be repeated all the way through to the end and to Gerald Ford, the last president to preside over Vietnam. So the Orthodox school says the domino theory is incorrect for a few reasons. First, they say because it exaggerates the importance of credibility, the concept of credibility. And the concept of credibility as it's used by successive presidents holds that what the United States does in one country will be interpreted by American allies as indicative of American willpower elsewhere. So if the United States bails out in one place, maybe we can't be sure that they won't bail out on us as well. And this is at a time where the U.S. has numerous alliances all over the world, and its containment strategy is dependent on all these alliances. So they say that the credibility thing is exaggerated. Countries don't really work that way. They're not going to think ill of the United States if it loses country over here, because our country is different. The second point they make in support of dismissing the domino theory is that when you look at the end of the war in 1975, most of the dominoes don't fall, including in Southeast Asia, which was always the biggest concern. There's only a few countries. And of course, there was Cambodia and the Khmer Rouge. Killed a few million people, but besides that, it's not a big deal. So they also then argue that the United States misinterpreted the communist threat in Vietnam, and they misinterpret Ho Chi Minh, who was the leader initially of the Vietnamese Communist movement. They misinterpret him as being part of an international communist conspiracy. They say instead Ho Chi Minh was really more of a nationalist, and he wasn't really in league with the bigger communist powers of China and the Soviet Union, and in fact he opposed the Chinese. They will also oftentimes refer to him as the Tito of Asia. You know who Tito is? Sebastian?
Dictator of Yugoslavia.
And what's he most famous for? Why would he be relevant potentially to Asia? Anyone know? Well, so Tito's best known for breaking ranks with the Soviet Union because he felt that after World War II, the Soviets were trying to dictate to him too much. They felt that his country was a sovereign, that Yugoslavia was sovereign, and therefore it didn't need to be treated like a vassal of the Soviet Union. So he breaks away from the Soviets. So the argument that is then made according to the Orthodox school is that Ho Chi Minh is kind of cut from the same cloth as Tito. He's independent-minded. He doesn't want to take direction from the Chinese or the Soviets. He's not like East Germany or Poland or these other communist satellite states. And so if that's the case, they argue, then there's just not this big threat of a global communist or Asian communist conspiracy. And they will also generally take a positive view of Ho Chi Minh as a sort of dedicated nationalist who is really committed to his cause, and they contrast him favorably oftentimes with the leaders of the South Vietnamese, which gets us to our second answer to the big question. Was the war winnable? So Orthodox school said they think it's unwinnable, and a lot of it has to do with this issue of leadership. They say the North Vietnamese, Ho Chi Minh and his successors, were strong, they were dedicated, while the South Vietnamese, whom the United States supported, were weak and unmotivated, and the U.S. could not support them indefinitely. When it comes to military affairs, the Orthodox school tends to look at the North Vietnamese army and the Viet Cong, i.e. the Southerners fighting for the North Vietnamese, that these are crafty foes who are oftentimes outwitting the clumsy Americans. They tend to depict the war as American forces as inflicting needless civilian casualties, although they will generally acknowledge that American military power held off the North Vietnamese as long as American ground troops were there. But they argue in the long term, the American effort was doomed because eventually the American people were going to lose interest in the war or find it objectionable and ultimately pull out the American military commitment and leave South Vietnam to its fate. The Orthodox historians argue that there wasn't any sort of alternative strategy the United States could have pursued that would have led to a substantially better outcome. They argue that the cost, recognize that there perhaps were some alternative courses of action, but they were so extreme that the United States would never have taken them. Now, on the question of intention, there is some significant disagreement on the Orthodox side. Among moderates and some liberals, there is a perception that the war was something that was well-intentioned but simply went disastrously wrong. Others will attribute it to more pernicious intentions such as national hubris, racism, anti-communist paranoia, or simply the lust for power on the part of presidents. Marxists tend to view it as a manifestation of economic determinism, where this was inevitable to happen to the U.S. capitalist system, that it would go to war and then find itself in this terrible predicament.
C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast.
There are others too who are not necessarily, don't buy this determinist argument, but nonetheless tend to be sympathetic to the North Vietnamese because they are left-leaning socialists, similar to some extent to what we see in places like Cuba today. The Orthodox view is almost entirely a movement of the left, but there are a few on the right who accept its premises. Now, these are not people who sympathize for the communists, but they tend to be either isolationists or paleoconservatives who simply are averse to foreign interventions, or there are some who simply on pragmatic grounds think it was too costly and wasn't worth what it cost the United States. Now, this Orthodox narrative is largely solidified by about 1990, and it hasn't really changed much since that time. It has been revised around the edges by new research. Probably the most interesting development since that time was that Robert McNamara, who's the Secretary of Defense when the U.S. gets in, publishes a book called In Retrospect, and he actually echoes most of the arguments of the Orthodox school, which comes as a surprise to a lot of people, and American veterans tend to be furious at him. He's applauded by those who had opposed the war. He does, should note, try to do so while avoiding taking personal responsibility for all of these messes, which makes him an even more controversial character. To the Orthodox school historians nowadays, many of them will say that essentially the big issues of the war have been decided by historians, by which they tend to mean themselves, and therefore we don't really need to spend a whole lot more time on these big issues. We can delve further into niche topics. They will, if you press them further, sometimes argue that we have very distinguished historians who have really written the defining books on this subject, and which I think is not a very satisfactory answer. If I had asked you to defend a position on a controversial subject and you simply said, well, a group of very distinguished professors agreed with this position, I would say that's not enough, because you can find very distinguished professors who say all sorts of preposterous things. You need to actually find arguments and supporting evidence to make that case. There's also another reason why the Orthodox school, in many cases, has turned away from the big issues and towards these niche topics, or micro-histories, we might call them. There is, especially in this country, a general trend in academic history toward race, class, and gender studies, and particularly those with concerning discrimination and oppression. So to give you a few recent examples of popular books in this genre from the study of the Vietnam War, one is called An Army of Fire: How the U.S. Army Confronted Its Racial Crisis in the Vietnam Era. And by the way, that just won the Society of Military History Book Award, which is also interesting because it's not really about the military in its business of fighting wars. Another one is called An American Brothel, Sex and Diplomacy During the Vietnam War. And a third is Pulp Vietnam, War and Gender in Cold War Men's Adventure Magazines. Now, these do largely stay away from the central political controversies, but they still are, I'd say, politically charged, because they do fit into broader narratives about things like the U.S. military being systematically racist or sexist. A related point to this is that younger scholars may get concerned that if they write about the big issues, they might offend some senior scholars. If you write about Vietnamese prostitutes or American racists, you're probably unlikely to offend the hiring committee or tenure committee that you are dependent on. So in my opinion, say these microhistories have become, in fact, a pretty big waste of time and resources for our educational establishments, because I don't think our society obtains a lot of value from analyzing toxic masculinity in men's adventure magazines, for example. I said that's my opinion. You should decide for yourself at some point whether we should be funding, and oftentimes with state money, these sorts of histories that are read by almost nobody and seem to have some sort of ideological slant to them. And this, by the way, is why academic history has become an unpopular major at many schools other than this one, because most young people, I think, do recognize the big questions are more important than little microhistories, particularly ones with an ideological bent. Now, there are some niche histories that are valuable to understanding the war. We have, for example, including on the Orthodox side, we've had some who've looked at John F. Kennedy's decisions in Vietnam that did help recast general perception of the war. Seen some things on Lyndon Johnson's decision-making, or what the Chinese and the Soviets are doing during the war. And those, certainly some of those have been valuable in helping clarify things. But again, the Orthodox school hasn't really shifted position on these two fundamental questions of, was the war strategically necessary and was it winnable? All right, so let's now talk about the revisionists. The first of these revisionists were, for the most part, American military officers or government officials who had lived through the war and, based partly on that experience, were convinced that the war was strategically necessary and that it was winnable. The most famous of these early revisionists is Colonel Harry Summers. He writes a book called On Strategy in 1982. Becomes highly influential, especially in the military. And now a lot of the points Summers made are basically the same points that had been made by American military leaders during the war. And we'll get more into this as we go along. But there's a lot of things the U.S. military was proposing that the civilian leadership refused to do. And so he's mostly focused on the question of winnability, not the strategic stakes. So what are these things, what are these actions that he thinks could have won the war? One of the big ones is severing the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos. Ho Chi Minh Trail, I'll put it up here, we'll be talking a lot more about this too, but Ho Chi Minh Trail refers to the North Vietnamese logistical lines that go through Laos and Cambodia and avoid going through the demilitarized zone between the two Vietnams. The U.S. never does put troops in there. Later in the war, the South Vietnamese have a limited expedition. But he argues this is something the U.S. should have done from the beginning, which is also something the military advocates during the war. And he also says the U.S. should have used a different strategy of bombing. So the Lyndon Johnson approach which we'll get into more detail on later, is called gradual escalation, based on the idea that you start slow and build up. And he says, no, that was a big mistake. Had we started off intensively in front, things could have turned out differently. Again, this is something the generals argued at the time. Now, there's another group of revisionists that gets going around this time that also believes the war was winnable, but they think it was not a question of using more force, but using force differently. And these revisionists are often referred to as the hearts and minds revisionists. So these revisionists argue that the United States fought the war in a conventional manner, and when it should have fought it in an unconventional and more of a counterinsurgency manner, that it shouldn't have used big forces to run around chasing after the enemy, but instead broken down its troops into smaller units and focused more on securing the population of South Vietnam. There will be a few academic historians who will join the military officers in making these arguments. The most famous of them is a guy named Gunter Louie. And he writes a book called America in Vietnam, which was published in 1978. And it was very well researched and well argued. And he focuses a lot on the questions of, but he does take the hearts and minds view, and he also looks at a lot of the allegations about war crimes, illegal actions taken by the United States. And he never really is very popular in academic circles, but he does help discredit a lot of the more outlandish myths of that were put forward on the Orthodox side of things. Then there is a new wave of revisionism that starts in the late 1990s, and by this time there's a lot more primary source material available, so it's a lot easier to get information, support points. Some of these scholars are people with PhDs, although few of them work at colleges and universities. One of these is H.R. McMaster. Anybody know who H.R. McMaster is? Lenny, you look like you know.
He, in the Gulf War, led a tank battle, and then later went on to serve as Secretary of Defense.
Close. National Security Advisor. Yes. And in fact, he just came out with a book about a week ago, so you may have seen him on TV, for those of you who watch TV or other social media. So he was National Security Advisor under Trump. And in 1997, he writes this book called Dereliction of Duty. And he focuses that book mainly on the decision by the United States to get into the war, which is pretty popular at the time. The book assumes new importance when he becomes National Security Advisor and becomes kind of a household name in this country. He's now at the Hoover Institution with Victor Davis Hanson, who some of you got to see this past weekend at the conference. So I was part of this sort of movement in Vietnam War historiography. I published a book in 1997 about pacification, and then a book in 2006 called Triumph Forsaken, which I've not assigned to you because we'll be talking about a lot of the points, and I want you to read other things. But that book went up to 65, and then the sequel, Triumph Regained, which goes 65 to 68, came out last year. I also should add that you should make sure to, I don't want to force feed you with any particular ideas, and I think by now have realized that professors are not demigods, although some of them still suffer from that illusion. But you should, in fact, question what they say, even if they're the professor in your class. So the books that come out between about 1995 and 2010 cover a lot of ground that hadn't really been covered well before. McMaster shines a lot of light on the decision to get in. There's a 1963 coup attempt, or successful coup, that overthrows the South Vietnamese president, which we'll be covering in detail. But there's a lot of new information that comes out about that event and what it tells us about the broader questions of the war. There are a lot of additional inquiries into the international factors and international stakes during the Vietnam War, and especially concerning the threat posed by communism to other countries, and by this question of credibility as to whether what the United States did in Vietnam really had a bearing on other countries of great importance. And some of these scholars conclude that, in fact, yes, credibility really was very valid, that if the U.S. had bailed out in Vietnam, we have now evidence from a lot of other countries. There's leaders talking about how if the U.S. bails out in Vietnam, that they're not going to trust the United States anymore and make an accommodation with the communist powers. And by the way, this same issue recurred again in 2021 over the debate in Afghanistan, where we saw dispute over whether pulling out of Afghanistan is going to undermine America's credibility in places like Taiwan and Ukraine. And of course, whether that actually happened is still a point of contention. But we had administrations certainly saying, well, just because we left Afghanistan doesn't mean that those countries are going to think any less of us, or that our enemies like Vladimir Putin might be emboldened. The revisionists, these newer revisionists, reject the argument that what happens in 1975 proves that the domino theory was false, because they argue that 1965 is a very different situation than 1975, and in fact, much of what happens in those intervening 10 years is the result of what the United States does in 1965. We see China is transformed in that period. It's no longer a deep adversary of the United States and a strong ally of North Vietnam. We see other countries are strengthened by the American stand. And so on that basis, we've got to look elsewhere for information on exactly what was at stake. Revisionists also have a much less positive view of Ho Chi Minh. They don't accept this argument that he's this really more of a nationalist. They say, in fact, he is an internationalist, and that he subscribed to what was fairly standard communist doctrine, that the international communist movement takes precedence over your narrow national interests. They point to evidence that he was working with the Soviets and Chinese, and they point to instances where he rejects this idea of Tito, this idea that you can be an independent nationalist while being part of the communist movement. Revisionists also attack these three people, Halberstam, Sheen, and Carnot, who helped develop the Orthodox narrative, pointing out that these individuals were actually closely involved in the events of the Vietnam War. They were not neutral observers, and that what they wrote later was actually colored by their involvement. In particular, this goes back to the 1963 coup. So up until this time, those journalists were actually in favor of the war, and then they support this coup. And then when the coup turns out to be a disaster, they attempt to rewrite history to absolve themselves of responsibility for this. In fact, they play a pretty large role in convincing the United States government to go ahead with this coup. They had predicted that coup would lead to improvement in the military situation, but in fact, it leads to the opposite, the purging in the government. And so they actually go against what they'd even written up till this time and start claiming that, well, actually, no, the situation was already lost. So the fact that we proposed something and it went bad doesn't really matter because it was all lost to begin with, which the revisionists don't find that argument convincing, in fact, find that things were going pretty well till the coup. Revisionists also will delve deeper into the latter years of the war, by which I mean 1969 to 75. Most of the early Orthodox works and most of the reviews of people like Halberstam, Sheen, and Carnot will argue that they spend almost all their time talking about the earlier periods of the war. After 1968, they cover the war in very cursory fashion, generally contending that by this point the war is just lost and we don't need to spend a lot of time talking about it. But a lot of the revisionists argue that in fact this is a very important period and needs a lot more study, and that in fact what we see in this period, the South Vietnamese government is getting stronger, which runs contrary to the notion that the South Vietnamese government was weak, as the Orthodox school argues. They'll argue that in fact the so-called Viet Cong, the Southern Communists, are largely wiped out, and it's basically a war of South Vietnam versus the North Vietnamese army at this point. And the most well-known proponent of this view particularly is Louis Sorley.
C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast.
He publishes a book called A Better War, which also becomes highly influential in Iraq and Afghanistan when those wars arise and people are looking for ideas on how do we apply the lessons of Vietnam. His book will be one of the most influential of these. And Sorley says that the war is very much shifting in the favor of the South Vietnamese in the latter period. He emphasizes General Creighton Abrams, who we'll be talking about at length, who takes over as senior U.S. commander in 1968. And Sorley says that he basically sides with the hearts and minds revisionists. He says that General Abrams went from a conventional search and destroy strategy to clear and hold. And we'll get more into these as we go along, but search and destroy essentially refers to the idea that you just send big units out to go try to pulverize the enemy. Clear and hold is you send out smaller units, you go an area, you hold on to it, help develop or consolidate control over the population. And Sorley makes the case, which some other revisionists have made, but not as deeply, that South Vietnam is actually winning the war in the early 1970s, and that it was only lost because American support was withdrawn, and that American support didn't have to be withdrawn. There are other revisionists who come out and go into a lot more detail on some of the things Harry Summers talked about, just saying it's not the problem that what we're doing inside South Vietnam, but it's, the U.S. messed up because of what it did not do outside of South Vietnam. They talk a lot, as he does, about cutting the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos. Also looking at Cambodia, there's later find out lots of communist supplies going to Cambodia through the port of Sihanoukville. And then also North Vietnam itself. And one of the other options that was considered but never employed was to actually invade North Vietnam, the source of the enemy's manpower. So some of these revisionists say, well, there were actually some very good opportunities here, and the U.S. just missed out on them. They also, again, provide more information on this question of gradual escalation, that in fact, had the U.S. undertaken a different approach to the bombing, that it might have achieved what it was trying to achieve. And these are controversies that we will get into in much more depth in the classes to come. Now, Court notes that the revisionists spend a lot of time on counterfactual analysis. So, anyone want to tell me what counterfactual analysis is? Yeah, Luke.
It's basically like situations that didn't happen in reality. So if this had happened, then this would have happened, basically.
Mm-hmm. Is that you think it's a valid way of historical study? Well, this is actually a big controversy in the world of history. There were some who would argue, well, we like to talk about things that actually happen rather than those that don't. And so in the case of Vietnam, so revisionists, their arguments are largely based on what might have been. So to say that the U.S. bombing strategy could have been more effective, we have to speculate to some degree about what things would have looked like in North Vietnam, how North Vietnam might have acted differently. And so this is sometimes seen as a weakness in the revisionist position, that they are relying on this counterfactual analysis, speculating things that have not actually occurred. It is worth pointing out, though, that both sides in this debate actually rely heavily on counterfactual analysis. So the Orthodox school, as I mentioned, they talk about, they speculate what would have happened had the United States pulled out of Vietnam in 1965. And they tell us, well, it really wouldn't have harmed American interests. Well, that also is a counterfactual. They are speculating about what would have happened had the United States pulled out in 65. Of course, the United States does not pull out of 65, so we'll never know. When you say the war was, if you argue the war was unwinnable, you are again thinking about how other strategies might have played out. To make the claim that the war was unwinnable, you have to have some reason, some basis for saying that these alternative strategies would not have worked. And I would argue that even though these conclusions are based on probabilities and reason rather than actual events, I would argue they are in fact very useful to us in understanding history, because without them, we cannot really judge most decision making, and that's one of the most important things we learn from history. For those of you who have already spent some time around the military, you know that the military spends a great deal of its time studying history in order to get better understanding of how to make decisions. And if you don't consider a range of options and how things could have played out differently, you're not going to, I think, learn very much about how to make decisions. I'll give you another example that is maybe a little easier to comprehend. So you've all come to Hillsdale College, and none of you can say with any certainty what would have happened if you had gone to, say, another college. And so can you say with 100% certainty that, my experience here was the best choice? Well, you do, however, have other information that you can use to make that decision. You do know what courses you've taken here, including many highly stimulating courses in the history department. And you know probably from talking to friends and acquaintances that some of them may still be sleeping right now because they were staying up late last night having fun. And so you, based on information like this, you can probably make a fair estimate that, in fact, there was a sound basis for your decision. But also add that we oftentimes don't think about how much we rely on counterfactual analysis when we study history, but really whenever we pass judgments on events and individuals, we are engaging in some process of reasoning about what could have been done differently. So let's take a great example from our history, George Washington. So George Washington, most historians, and I think probably most Americans, would say he was a pivotal actor in the founding of this country, and that perhaps without his leadership, things might have turned out very differently. So that argument, implicit in that argument, is the idea that we are thinking, what would things look like if George Washington were not in there? What if somebody else had been in there? We can't say for sure. There was never somebody else in that position. But we are thinking about this sort of hypothetical analysis and making that judgment. And again, we're going to be doing a fair amount of this as we go along. We're not all just going to be talking about counterfactuals, and we'll spend a lot of time talking about the facts. But as I said, the biggest two questions about the war fundamentally depend on this counterfactual analysis. So one other revisionist book from this period that I want to highlight, because you'll be reading some of it, it's a book by a fellow named B.G. Burkitt. His book is entitled Stolen Valor. Anyone heard that phrase used recently? Sebastian, where have you heard?
I mean, just among military circles, a common example is like when someone wears a lot of military. A common example I hear in politics is John McCain about how he flew in the Black Hawk and all that that was at the very least greatly embellished. Military people often cite that as stolen valor, claiming he did something when he didn't.
Yes, it actually, and the term originates with this book by Burkitt that you'll be reading. And in fact, it's become so influential that Congress passes the Stolen Valor Act to punish people for falsifying military service. And of course, one of the vice presidential candidates just in the past couple weeks has been accused of some of this. And it is a big problem. And the fact that people become so outraged about it, I think, is indicative of some of the broader controversy. And again, we'll be talking a lot more about this. So Burkitt in the book does talk about, primarily he's focused on the question of Vietnam veterans, which is not one of the two big issues I mentioned, but it is a very big issue and one we will be also exploring. In general, the Orthodox school tends to portray Vietnam veterans as people who were damaged psychologically in the war and that they were more subject to various social ills after the war. They were victims of a bad war oftentimes. And so Burkitt takes issue with these negative stereotypes. And some of this is through statistical analysis, looking at incidents of all these problems, veterans versus non-veterans. And he also has a lot of cases where he shows specific individuals who were engaged in fraud, who claim to have seen or done all these crazy things in Vietnam, and then he finds out through their service records, in fact, they were never in Vietnam, or they were a cook who never was anywhere near combat. He also, by the way, I mentioned last time we talked about Rambo. Rambo had caused kind of an epidemic of this phony veteran phenomenon because it gave a certain degree of respectability to Vietnam veterans. So you see this proliferation of people coming out and suddenly claiming to be Vietnam War heroes. So all of these more recent revisionist works have gained a lot of popular attention, not much in terms of academic acclaim. We have an academic world today that is, very divided, or say one side of the political spectrum is almost in complete control. But in terms of the population, government officials, the revisionist point of view has become quite popular. And we saw it in the video we saw last time with Ronald Reagan speaking to the VFW. He espoused some of the key points from the revisionist school, particularly this idea that the country's or the military's hands were tied behind their back. George W. Bush, when he becomes president in 2001, as some of these revisionist accounts are coming out, and he will cite some of them in his speeches and in meetings. And then H.R. McMaster, when he becomes National Security Advisor in 2017, will draw explicitly on some of the lessons of Vietnam. So in the readings and the classes to come, we'll be getting into more detail on the main points of debate between Orthodox and revisionist. And you have a lot of primary documents that will also allow you to assess this information without any filtration. And you have secondary sources as well that have, some are more favorable towards the Orthodox, some more inclined towards the revisionist. And as a reminder, one of the main reasons you're here in college is to be able to learn to think for yourselves. So you are here not merely to echo what someone else says, but to think about it yourself and think through it. These tend to be controversial issues, and so there's often good arguments for both. But I would encourage you to go into this with an open mind. Okay, any questions from today or from the readings that you had for today? Sebastian.
I just wanted to ask about unconventional warfare and counterinsurgency. I don't know much about the Vietnam War, hence why I'm taking this course, but my understanding was that we did a little bit of that with Mac v. SOG. How much of that did we actually do in the war?
Good question, and we'll be getting into this in greater detail. But there are some programs that are, here we're talking about the Hearts and Minds School, because some of the material leads you to believe there was none of this done. That basically it was all the search and destroy. You send out big American units. There is well, first there's something called the Marine Combined Action Program, which we'll get into, which was very much doing what these folks were recommending, that took a Marine squad, say 8 or so Marines, and put them into a village with South Vietnamese forces and left them there permanently to hold on to the population, protect them. So we have that. There are later in the war, and said Sorley also talks about this, they do start taking more of the bigger forces and breaking them down into smaller units and placing them into different villages, again, for this purpose of, as we often call it, population security. And you can mention too, because we'll get into this later, if you recall some of the debates over Iraq and Afghanistan, granted most of you probably weren't paying a whole lot of attention in, say, 2007, but there's the big dispute within the military, which is derived from this controversy, where you have basically two groups. One calls itself population-centric counterinsurgency, and they basically borrow from this school. They argue counterinsurgency, it's all about struggle for the people. You have to protect the population. Don't worry about the enemy who's running off in the mountains or the jungle. And then you have another group called enemy-centric, which is more focused on, well, primarily focused on going after the enemy. And so they would argue that the U.S. military, when it was doing search and destroy, that they actually had the right idea. And any of you took my counterinsurgency class? Well, that'll be offered later, but we actually go into even more detail then on these two schools of thought. But yes, we will get into that here, because it's one of the most interesting questions, I think, is it really true? Was the United States fighting a conventional war when it should have been fighting something else? Oh, and you mentioned Mac v. SOG too. That's actually a bit of a different issue. That mainly involves operations in Cambodia and Laos, which were designed to mainly identify targets for destruction. So while the U.S. didn't go into Cambodia and Laos, except briefly in 1970, knowing that the Ho Chi Minh Trail is such a problem, they had these covert operations that would go in to try to identify targets in the Ho Chi Minh Trail that could then be bombed. Other questions? Yeah, Lenny.
Do you think that if we had the political support to do it, do you think the Ho Chi Minh Trail could have been disrupted, at least, by the U.S. military?
Yes, I do. And we're going to have more in-depth conversation on this. But there is actually, in 1971, the South Vietnamese go into Laos and cut it, but only temporarily. But as I said, there was a lot of planning and preparation, or conceptual design for American operations into Laos, and I think it was feasible. One of the big things too that's come out recently is we know more about North Vietnamese logistics, and logistics are a critical aspect of this war, because the North Vietnamese cannot fight if they don't have ammunition, if they don't have food. Those are the two biggest things they require. And for a long time, people underestimated their reliance on external supply for those things. We now know that, in fact, in many cases, they were unable to operate because they didn't have the necessary supplies. And so that if that's the case, the logistical conflict becomes even more important. Yes, Lucas.
So you were talking about how the Orthodox school claims that most of the dominoes didn't fall after we pulled out in 1975, or after 1975 specifically. But then you mentioned like Cambodia and Khmer, and several Indo-Chinese countries did end up falling. So
Right.
what were the other dominoes that they would have considered bigger or more important?
Yeah, it's a good question. So at first I said we'll get into this in greater detail, but mostly when people think about the domino theory, they're thinking about Asia. There might be some after effects in Europe or the Middle East, but the most important place is Asia. It's always where people are thinking most. So what are the big countries? The biggest countries in play, well, that have some relevance to Vietnam are first Japan. Japan is, at this point, is the only non-Western nation that's been able to become sort of something close to a global power. And they've been laid low by war, but they still have great industrial potential, strong cultural basis for revitalization. And so that is the first and foremost concern. So is there evidence, so we'll get into this, is there evidence that Japan's might have done something different had the U.S. left in 1965? After that, the next most significant is Indonesia, which, anyone know why Indonesia is so important? Yeah, go ahead.
For trade in the South China Sea, I would assume.
Yeah, that's part of it. There's a very famous one of the most important waterways in the world is the Straits of Malacca, which goes through Indonesia. So that's a big part of why Indonesia is considered important. It's also the world's largest Muslim population, tremendous natural resources, especially oil. And we're going to talk a lot about Indonesia because I do think there's a great deal of evidence that what happens in Vietnam influences events in Indonesia. In fact, there's a coup in the end of 1965 where the pro-communist government is overthrown. And how does Vietnam affect that? I think it has a big impact. You've also got Thailand is another one that considered to be of strategic importance. Malaysia, Singapore, the Philippines. And this also gets into another question which we'll explore later. Would it have made a difference if these countries were now, if they look like North Vietnam, if they were communist? Would it matter if Indonesia or Thailand or Japan were not on our side? We're now in a struggle in Asia with China. And so the revisionists certainly argue that by preserving Indonesia and Thailand and the Philippines and South Korea and Taiwan, that even though the United States didn't win the tactical battle in Vietnam, that it actually won the broader struggle, because the objective from the beginning was to not just save South Vietnam, but to save Asia from communism. And one can argue, as I said, this is another counterfactual that we'll get into, could argue that the Vietnam was necessary to actually save those other countries. And by the way, the Orthodox school doesn't argue that Japan and Indonesia are unimportant. And I think if you ask them, they'd say, well, yeah, those countries are important, but they weren't going to fall. So the question really is not if this potential stakes were high, but just whether what happened in Vietnam was actually relevant to what goes on in these other Asian countries. Other questions? All right, well, we'll stop here for today. Thank you for your attention, and I will look forward to seeing you all on Thursday.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Book Notes Plus podcast, you can find all the episodes wherever you get your podcasts. Lectures in History will be back next week.